Hello and welcome everyone. Let's get started. So a little bit about who am I? Why am I giving a presentation on securing things solo? Well, my name is Jason Kinsfather. I've been a solutions engineer working here at Semgrep for about 10 months now. I primarily work with mid-market and small and medium businesses. So the majority of application security teams that I interact with, if they even have a dedicated AppSec function, are usually composed of like one or two people, maybe seven if they're super lucky. But I pretty much work with small shops that are often under provisioned and pretty scrappy. Now, what is Semgrep? Well, if you are for some reason unfamiliar, we are the active and proud maintainers of the Semgrep open source engine, which is a static analysis tool. It's built by developers for developers, meaning that it's fast, it's easy to deploy, and it runs on source code. The other part of the Semgrep open source project is our open source rules, which are all community contributed. And these are what kind of tell your engine what to look for or what anti-patterns to look for in your source code. Now, as like a proprietary company, we of course maintain the project, but we also extend and build upon it. So we have our proprietary extension called the Semgrep Pro Engine, and this extends the capabilities by adding advanced things like data flow analysis across functions and files, better support for each language's core APIs, and also powering 3 different products built on top of it. So there's Semgrep Code, which is the Pro Engine set of Pro rules, Semgrep Supply Chain, which uses the SAST engine to figure out what dependencies are being used in a like vulnerable or reachable manner. And then Semgrep Secrets, which uses semantic understanding to identify and then also validate secrets against your APIs. So we have 3 different products for 3 different areas of coverage, and we're kind of able to channel our resources into improving one engine to power all 3. But enough about that. Let's get into what we're here for today. So, when we're talking about the challenges that I see smaller teams face, and we want to talk about solutions, we first need to understand what are we up against. I love data. I was like a informatics data science major, and so I use this presentation as an excuse to review all 150 customers that I've had the opportunity to interact with over the last 10 months, kind of tabulate what was going on for them. And what I found based off of my N equals 150 sample is that on average, for every one application security personnel that my customers had, they had around 160 developers that they were supporting and around 270 repositories that they needed to secure. So in just a numbers game, like of course we know these numbers are off and kind of disproportionate, but it was fun to like do the math myself instead of taking Gartner's word for it or whatever. And so you're often up against a lot of things and a lot of code, but you're also often up against business. And what do I mean by that? Well, at the end of the day, engineering has to deliver features. Those features bring money to the business. And unfortunately, the requests that you make of them or the tooling you put in their path, that can get in the way of delivering those features. And the question then becomes like, well, why should I prioritize what AppSec is asking me to do when I've got stuff to do of my own? And that kind of division is often reflected in the financials available to the teams that I work with, because security is a cost center. It's not a revenue generator. And getting funding and then proving return on investment on the funds allocated can be difficult. And the final thing that you're often up against is the organizational structure or culture. The application security tooling space has been around now for 2 decades or so. And I've had the privilege of working for the oldest static analysis vendor on the market, and also now with one of the newest, which is Semgrep. And one of the things that delights me a lot about the customers that I see working here is often that the culture is not as much of a barrier or or a problem. That is, I meet many engaged professionals that have executive alignment with what they're doing. They have the trust and support of engineering and engineering leadership. And so they have a lot of alliances built up and goodwill. And that's not the case for a lot of companies. I do work with companies where AppSec is very siloed. They've fallen into more of an antagonistic relationship with engineering. And I work with people who've walked into a brand new role And whoever was there previously maybe rolled out a first generation SAST tool that was noisy and unfriendly. There's a wave of developer backlash, and now they're inheriting that culture and need a way to help turn that around. And in addition to that, we have this ever increasing risk that you need to guard against. And there's this is a double-edged blade here, right? We have on one side like external threats that are increasingly prioritizing application level attacks, API attacks, supply chain attacks, but also on the other side, there's internal expansion of the attack surface itself. You have development velocity growing. I work with orgs that develop and deploy multiple releases in a day. And you as one person or two don't have the capability to keep up with that testing. Um, and I also see a fair number of customers that their attack surface is growing so large that they don't understand it. And when I ask, well, what are we dealing with here? They don't know what's in their code base. They have a growing variety of technologies that they can't stay on top of. Again, looking at the data, the average customer I work with has 6 to 7 languages that they support, and they need to have familiarity with that. And the major libraries, major frameworks, the technologies like serverless containers, microservices, etc. Um, it's just a lot to deal with. But that aside, like everyone knows that there's problems. Like there's problems, and you wouldn't be here if you didn't. Now I want to kind of talk about some things that you can do and some things that we've done here at Semgrep to address them. Before we get into like security tooling and Semgrep and how it can assist, I'd like to discuss kind of some activities that you can do to set yourself up for success before you even install some kind of automated security tooling that's going to then, spit out a whole bunch of alleged vulnerabilities at you and your developers. So first of all, we need to know, what are we protecting? And it's a simple question, but depending on your organization, it could be difficult to answer. I meet a lot of people who, again, don't know what they have. They might, or they just have like a rough idea of like, I've got like 500 repositories. And yeah, there's some Java and Python, but the developers are using like a hodgepodge of other things. I'm not really sure what it is. Um, and, you know, that's okay. But if we're going to have a tool in place that's going to spit a whole bunch of stuff out, we need help prioritizing it. So we need to understand more about not only what's out there, but what is the risk that it poses to the business. Um, I have one client who it's like they're like, well, we've got like 600 repositories. But then when I say, hey, well, how many of those are active repositories? How many access sensitive data? How many are a high business impact? How many are exposed to the internet? How many have like public APIs? And all of a sudden that number drops from like, oh, I gotta like address 500 to 26. And so obviously we do want to protect everything, but we're a small team. We only have 24 hours in a day. And so the other way to help us with prioritization is doing some threat modeling, thinking about how would an attacker approach your organization. And if you haven't done this already, I strongly recommend trying it. Um, and so, there's a lot of different vulnerability classes and things that we could focus our time and attention on, but what's really going to be the most impactful vectors of entry that we can focus on eliminating is important. And then last of all, most importantly, you need help. And the most successful organizations that I see, just straight up hands down, are the ones that have security champions programs in place, whether those are super formal and organized or more informal. Uh, you need to know like, who are your champions and who are they? They're typically developers that are also responsible for AppSec. And they can help you scale AppSec knowledge, help you identify and fix vulnerabilities, maybe train other developers. But most importantly, embed all of those tasks into the sprint or whatever methodology they're using, and ideally influence the planning so that application security features are actually, part of the feature list and to be created and developed and shipped. I mention all these things because they are super helpful before we even start talking about tooling. And they're also something that, we're kind of addressing with one of our new kind of gifts to the world, Semgrep Academy. So if you want to learn more about these kinds of application security activities, especially like the creation and maintenance of security champions programs, I strongly recommend checking out our new training platform. Semgrep Academy was conceived and built by Tanya Jenka, who's been an AppSec thought leader for almost a decade now. She wrote an awesome book on AppSec called Alice and Bob Learn Application Security, and you can learn from her and other professionals for free at academy.semgrep.dev. I especially recommend the Application Security Foundations levels 1, 2, and 3. And these are about designing your application security program, growing a culture of AppSec beyond, just your team. There's also resources to teach developers secure coding, learning to work with Semgrep and write Semgrep rules, and so on and so forth. So just putting that out there, it's free. Check it out. And so that aside, um, let's dig a little deeper into the kind of like people and processes problem because, we want to scale security so that, of course, the burden doesn't land just on your shoulders. And SimGrep is really designed with this idea in mind. Um, a lot of AppSec 1.0 tooling is often designed for the security team first. And then as shift left became more of a buzzword and used, they were kind of like, let's just slap some shift left features on it. But here at SimGrep, we're trying to not just pay lip service to shift left, but actually deliver effectively on that promise. So let's start with what shifting left is not. Shifting left is not just bringing issues to developers early in the development lifecycle, just kind of throwing them over the fence to them. It's definitely one part of the equation, but it's the easiest and most obvious part. I think every AppSec team understands, like, hey, there's two of us, there's 500 developers. If there's any hope of us tackling this amount of, vulnerabilities and debt and new stuff coming in, we're going to need to get developers involved. And so you can interpret shift left to mean this. This is what a lot of vendors are doing. They might scan your code and have a Jira integration that then says, okay, all your criticals and highs, throw them over the fence. Your devs will figure it out. And thank goodness it's not super late in the SDLC, so it's not as burdensome. Like that's okay, but usually when I see people who are coming to me after using these kinds of tools, they're unproductive at best, and at worst, actively harmful and destroying their relationship with their developers. Ultimately, we want developers to view AppSec teams and the tools they deploy as assets and not blockers. And so ideally for us, shifting left is not just showing things to developers, it's showing them directly to developers without the security team engaging. I do see customers that come from other automated tooling, and when I ask, what is your current testing process like? They're kind of like, well, the scans get done, the devs look at the results, and then they pester me and they ask me, how do I triage this? How do I remediate this? And so that's kind of what I do a lot with a lot of my time is helping them answer all of those questions. And that's okay. But the goal is to save you time and work and also save the developers time by enabling them to fix the issue earlier within the development process or by setting up secure guardrails in place that prevent issues from cropping up at all. And so the hard truth of all of this is that, if developers aren't fixing issues because it's going to take them, I don't know, 30 minutes, an hour to confirm that something is a false positive, or they have to, hit you up and say, what do I do? I don't know what to do. I would argue as a former developer myself, like they're kind of making the right call by just ignoring all of those issues. So if you're not seeing developers engage with security findings, it means you're not giving them enough to work with. And it's only once you start bringing security issues to developers in a more actionable, less ambiguous, less noisy way that you might see things improve. And that will take time because trust and goodwill takes time to earn. But the best way to start and make these improvements is to be communicative about it. Get in front of engineering leadership, advertise to them, advertise to your developers, and let them know that you're trying. I've seen some orgs create like little like videos to advertise what they're trying to do. Of like, hey, we're getting a new security tool. This is what our goal is. We'd love your input and your help. I've seen that work to great success. And so when it comes to like selecting security tooling, ultimately we would want tooling that's going to help support whatever that developer engagement strategy or any strategy to help kind of spread the burden of security. I have teams that have used the tool to get QA involved, product security or DevOps or whatever it might be. And you just want to select a solution that's going to enable your plan. Some things that are more in line with what we believe that security tooling should be easy to roll out. And I'll talk in a little bit about some work we've done recently to help with that. It should also provide you mechanisms to help you deal with noise. And the reason for that is that every automated code scanning tool that completes analysis in a desirable amount of time is going to have noise. And that's just a mathematical certainty that we have to deal with. And the question is, how do we manage it? How can our solution help us shelter developers from the noise? Does it provide us means of reducing it? And what we believe helps the most with that is transparency. So here at Semgrep, we strive to make it clear what is running when you run a scan. What are those rules? Why do they match? Why do they fail? Um, and then give you easy means to customize things to be more tailored to your org should there be a particular rule that's noisy. And so I'll kind of go into more detail about how we address each of these concerns. So to start off with, let's discuss deployment. Now, since Semgrep runs on source code, deployment is much simpler than a tool that requires integration at build time. And so, we provide a pretty simple Docker container. You spin it up, you run one command, and it will run all the products you're licensed for. So it's pretty easy peasy, but you still have to set those pipelines up. And that can be a real challenge, especially for a small team. I do see some companies that you might be lucky to be at, where engineering, DevOps, security, they're all walking in lockstep and they coordinate super well. And, my security contact is kind of like, hey, DevOps, do you want to put this scanner in 800 repos? DevOps is like, sure thing, buddy, I'll do it. And then 2 days later, they have the pipelines rolled out, the scans are complete, and they've got their findings. Super magical, super rare. For most customers, you need to work with the teams that own the repos. You might have to work with DevOps on one repo at a time. You might have to exercise political capital, advocate for the tooling, and really like fight and convince people to set it up. And that could take a lot of effort. But even if you have willing teams where maybe it's not as much of pulling teeth to get stuff done, it's just hard to do at scale. Like, sure, I can set up pipelines for 10 repos, but what if I have 100? And what if there's new ones every day that I don't want to have to compare against my list of like, am I scanning that? I don't know. That's just, yeah, it's a lot. It's a headache. So we kind of decided, what, rollout doesn't have to be so difficult. And so we recently released a new feature called Semgrep Managed Scanning to kind of help you overcome the hurdles that I just mentioned. And this just makes onboarding fast. It's an easy button. You can just click and Semgrep will pull your repos and run scans on them for you. So right now this is in a public beta. It's available for github.com customers, soon for GitLab and then Bitbucket. But we'll run scans for you on a weekly basis. We'll also run them on every pull request, so more differential scanning. And that's for all 3 products. And it's super simple. So welcome to the Semgrep AppSec platform. This is our SAST-based hub for managing your program and findings and so on and so forth. Right now, I'm just looking at the projects page. I've got all of these repositories I've already onboarded, 62 of them. But I've got my GitHub organization connected, and so I can see also all of the projects that I'm not currently scanning. Now, if I wanted to onboard these with Semgrep Managed Scanning, it's pretty simple. I could just say, hey, let's select all of them, and then let's edit and enable managed scans. And just like that, we've got some auto scans. So this means that they're managed scanning that are all starting on all of those repos. And so just like that, we've managed to roll out. I've had some pretty awesome rollouts where we've gotten those 800 repos just started like this, and we've got findings now, and life is kind of golden. So that's the managed scanning piece, which is cool. So we've got our scans going, technology's kind of out of the way, but then we can spend time and address the more interesting questions of people and process, right? So how does Semgrep enable shifting left? How does it put things in front of developers and provide them with the guidance so that they can kind of take that burden off of you in security? Well, we do that by getting in the developer workflow. We run in their workflow so they don't have to go to some security tools UI and click around. We run super fast so that they don't have to wait for us. And then we also provide a whole bunch of guidance to help them quickly remediate issues before they move on to new things. And so like a typical dev workflow might look like something like this. I write my code, I commit it locally, I then push it, make my pull request. And the goal here is like to catch things before code gets merged into main. And there's 2 points typically that we kind of sit at. First is at the IDE level, so that you can kind of run scans automatically while you're coding and just catch that, especially like low-hanging fruit. And then a more thorough scan at pull request on the changes that you've made. Um, and that those findings, show up in your workflow, but also get contextualized with help from Semgrep Assistant, which is our like AI that helps. And so before, you merge something to main and then someone is like, hey, you introduced this thing, like you got to go back and fix that. And you're like, I don't have time to do that. I'm already working on a new thing. That's kind of the goal here. So like, yeah, working in the IDE, we have plugins available for Visual Studio and IntelliJ flavors, as well as Emacs. And these are, they run like a linter. They're available in the marketplace. You download them, and then as you code, Semgrep will automatically scan and mark the things. And if it's something that's like easily fixed with a quick fix, Semgrep will allow you to just quickly patch it, like shown in this little GIF here. Now, from like PR comments, well, let me demonstrate that flow with an actual like demo. So let's say I were to be, working on my repo and I were to add a new file. I was like, yeah, this is my super awesome like SQL create whatever, and it's a JavaScript file. Let me commit my changes, and I'm gonna create a new branch, maybe start a pull request. Go ahead and do that. Semgrep is now going to run for us as part of our checks. So the Semgrep scan gets queued, and it's now doing its thing. So it's just going to run on the changes that I've committed. So that way I just get results that are relevant to me. I'll let that go for a few seconds. One of the cool things here is that we get to kind of curate what developers get to see. So the rules that run and the results that get delivered, they're not necessarily everything that the tool can detect. And part of that is a strategy to, again, shelter developers from some of that noise. And I can kind of get into that in more detail here. While it's doing its thing, I can kind of show. So when we're looking at, let me move on to the policies page, like how Semgrep runs, it's going to be running a set of rules that are defined in a policy. And so these are all of the rules that I have set up. There's over 2,000 of them. All of these rules are open. So I can look at them, I can fork them, I can modify them, and really kind of make them my own. Rules run in different modes, which is super helpful. So a rule can run in like a monitor mode, and that's a silent detection, just like an old school like SAST tool. It's super useful when you are writing your own rules or your developers are trying out rules that they've written. And those rules might be noisier before they're like ready for prime time. So that stuff gets reported here to the platform, but it's not necessarily like exposed to the devs. Rules that run in a comment mode, those are the things that actually show up as pull request comments. And then last of all, for things that you're like, nah, no way is this getting into main, you want to build a policy around it. Those are things you'd put into like block to block the merge. So if we go back to our pull request, we can see the scan finished. Let me refresh. And so, I had my SQL query that I committed. Semgrep has identified, hey, like, you're not really kind of just putting some raw user data uh, into the SQL query. That could be pretty bad. And so, we'll highlight the issue. We're going to comment directly on the code. And then Semgrep Assistant will come in to do two things. It'll say like, hey, do I think this is a true or false positive? And if it's a true positive, like, here's what you could do to remediate. And so in this case, it's going to help us, you know, parameterize our SQL query and provide some step-by-step instructions on how that could be done. So the developer has a very clear path forward. And then, we ask for developer feedback and engagement by saying like, hey, was this helpful or was it not? And then the developer can, commit their changes or not. So I could automatically commit this. And then as soon as I do, Semgrep's going to run another scan and see, was our remediation successful or not? So that's the like developer like pull request workflow where they're able to get items, like return to them pretty fast, get more context on them, how they could remediate them, um, and all without like needing to go to someone else for help. Um, so let me go ahead and go through here. The really awesome thing about SimGrep Assistant is it really ups the fix rate. So like, of course we don't want to just find things, we want to fix them. And we've had devs like give feedback of how often those fixes have been helpful and the triaging has been helpful. And I'm someone who's super skeptical about LLMs. So I'm like, it's eye popping to me, but we've had a 97% like agreement rate where people have said, yes, I think this is either true or false positive, as you said. And also this remediation advice actually like worked, which is pretty awesome. Um, and so the cool thing about Assistant 2 is that it responds to some of the customizations that you might want to make. And customization is, in my opinion, critical. This has been borne out in industry research and independent academic research, but tools that are customized have less false positives and have a higher fix rate by like double or triple the amount of just a out of the box tool. Um, so you can run out of the box rules, and especially for smaller customers, that's probably what I'll see for the first like 6 months, maybe even a year, as developers get used to experiencing the tool and everything. But at some point, you may want to look at customizing and really making it your own. Um, and we kind of design things around that feedback loop of, starting rules out in a monitor mode, see how they perform, because every code base is different. And then the things that are helpful, you move that to that comment mode, receive that developer, you know, um, kind of iteration. Uh, and if it's not working, maybe it just needs to be tweaked before it's ready for that prime time. And then once like people are pretty used to things, maybe you have rules about like secure defaults that developers should use. There's a big difference between just identifying like actual security issues of like, hey, like, yeah, this user data went into this SQL statement, and then a secure default of, no, every time that we have a SQL statement, it needs to be parameterized. It may not be like an actual like, there may not actually be data flow that's actually like bad right now, but there could be in the future. And so it is just our default that that's what we do every single time. We validate our data every single time. Um, and you can write rules to help you enforce those, whatever that might be for your company. And so we take a lot look at like fix rate a lot when we think about like metrics, and I'll return kind of to the tool itself. Um, we can see now looking at our pull request scan that happened after we remediated our SQL injection, and you know the scan passed, our remediation was successful, and now we're good to merge this pull request. So that's pretty cool. Um, one of the things that like you know, you might have in place, let me go to my rule editor. So when we look at like Semgrep rules, um, they look kind of crazy, but um, they're pretty simple to read and write once you get the hang of it. I usually teach people to write rules in about 30 minutes, and developers catch on to them really fast. But this is just like a taint mode rule. So the actual rule is like here, and all it's doing is saying, hey, we're looking for data from a source, seeing where it gets to a vulnerable sink in our code. In this case, we're looking for like a logger. So user data coming off of a request going to a logger. And then this particular customization was like, hey, we want some kind of sanitization in place, and we want to be able to recommend that to our developers. And so every rule has a message it outputs. And this particular customer added this part, which was like, hey, as a standard, we leverage JSoup to do our sanitization. And the really cool thing about Semgrep Assistant is that it will incorporate anything that you add. So if I go to this pull request that was identifying this issue, so finding user data that that was being logged, SemGrep Assistant popped up and said, hey, yeah, um, you can actually sanitize this by using JSoup. And here's how you would import it, and then sanitize that specific parameter. Um, and here's what the finished code would look like. So that way you can start getting some more organizational tailoring, and some, again, secure defaults in place as you advise your developers, all without you needing to be there. And so, oh yeah, talking about like fix rate, that's something that if we're looking at our policy here, and let me actually look at the policy of my other demo org here. Pardon my clicking, but if I look at all of my rules, they have different fix rates. And this is not a real tenant, so we're not actually doing real remediation, but this fix rate says every single time a developer has seen this rule, how often have they actually fixed it in the pull request? Um, we want that to be 100%. Like, that means that what we are pushing to developers is relevant to them. It's helpful. It's something that they actually feel like is worth spending the time to do, because we lowered the barrier, the activation energy to actually get something done. Um, and so we kind of use that as our guiding metric, is that fix rate. And so, yeah, so tailoring rules can be really easy. Um, and it's something we definitely see like the most successful programs start to do. And not only that, but like I see a lot of orgs where as engineers get used to the tool, you've got those engineers who are tinkerers and they're like, hey, what is this SimGrep rule thing? And they start writing rules themselves. I have orgs where the engineering departments actually, like each engineering manager kind of has their own set of SimGrep rules that the team writes for themselves, with their own defaults. And so that's a great way to scale security and secure defaults across the org, is really starting to encourage that. And Semgrep just makes that easy. Um, yeah, we've also rolled out some new features to test out rules, which are pretty awesome. So I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with the polyfill.io supply chain attack. We've got a huge banner about it right here. Um, if you want to just search your code base for something, maybe you're writing a rule and want to test it, um, or maybe you want to say, hey, like this new 0-day just came out, where are we importing a package and using it? That's something that Semgrep's live code search can really help you with. So, within like 30 minutes of reading the article about polyfill, um, one person on our team was able to be like, hey, here's a rule to identify whether you're, in this case, loading polyfill from this malicious CDN. Um, so we've just created a generic rule that finds all the URLs in your code that come from that thing. And so I could then run this on any number of repos and say, hey, like, is this being imported from this malicious CDN? Is this a problem? Is this affecting me? So Semgrep will take that one rule, run it across all of the code, and boom, just like that, I can see I've got, one repo that's not affected, these three which are in these files. So now I could go in and remediate that and everything. So this is just a super fast way to test things out, test rules. If you have like a bug report that comes in, um, and you're like, hey, like this customer is reporting this. Sure, it exists in this part of the code that they're talking about, but does it exist elsewhere? You could write a rule and quickly check and see, because developers like to reuse things. We're lazy, and so if it exists in one part of your code base, it probably exists in other parts too. And this is just a super fast, snappy way to address that. So that ultimately is kind of the things that we have come up with to help scale security, create some secure defaults, and really increase your capabilities, especially as a small team, um, so that you aren't alone. And so I guess if there's any conclusion today, you know, you have limited resources. Maximizing those really requires some strategy and collaboration with other teams. And again, SimGrep Academy is a great resource if you want ideas of how to do that. And building that culture takes time. Um, and it's not something that's going to be done in a day, but if you are going to buy a security tool, if you're going to implement an open source security tool, whatever it might be, you want something that is going to help uh, implement your strategy, that something that's going to enable your developers so that they can be self-sufficient and on their own, and ultimately can be tailored to you and your needs. And with that, that's all I have to present for today.